I translated a classic essay about the nature of halacha, Jewish law, by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who was the leading rabbinic authority, we say, in the second half of the 20th century. It's called Halachic Man, and a second expanded edition of it will be appearing in September, published by Jewish Publication Society. And you want to get an idea of the nature of a person who is somehow committed to the study and the authority of Jewish law, that's about as good a place as you could find. So enough for my, as I say, PR for myself. Actually, it's really more for Rabbi Soloveitchik. So I'd like to begin actually acknowledging and thanking everyone for this very kind invitation. The Center for Research in Interreligious Discourse for inviting me, Professor Tamer, all the people who were working on all of the logistics, particularly Sandra Hauser, who I was in communication with, and I appreciate that they made this possible. It's a particular privilege for me to be the speaker alongside Alan Arkish, distinguished scholar and one of the great reviewers in the area of Jewish studies and Jewish thought, more broadly, a longtime friend and colleague, and who will be speaking about modernity in Judaism. But there's substantive as well as a type of personal connection between me and I call him Alan, that both Arkish and I have written about, he a bit more extensively than I, Moses Mendelssohn, whose dates are 1729 to 1786, the great figure of German Enlightenment, Aufklärung, who used his standing in general German society as an important philosopher in general philosophy to defend Jews and Judaism, and was an advocate for and an exponent of acculturation. So Mendelssohn's life and career, and Professor Arkish said he's going to come back to it, raise and show the connectedness of modernity and authority. So I'm not really going to speak about this, but beginning with modernity, for many scholars, Mendelssohn's advocacy of acculturation and enlightenment for Jews, broadly speaking, this movement of Haskalah, of Jewish enlightenment, really represents the dawning of a new era. That's a matter of debate, but this is oftentimes the way it is seen. But in coming more to my subject, Mendelssohn also raises, in a very pointed way, the issue of authority in Judaism. Now, while Mendelssohn was himself an observant Jew, who observed the details of Jewish law, and who advocated for the continuing authority of traditional Jewish law, halacha, with minor modifications, Professor Arkish and I don't quite see eye to eye on exactly how sincere he was, but at least publicly he was an advocate for that. Nevertheless, we could say he weakened in two ways traditional rabbinic authority, grounded, and I'm obviously going to come back to that, in knowledge of rabbinic law and knowledge of Jewish law. So negatively, Mendelssohn urged the rabbis to give up use of the ban, excommunication. If people aren't towing the line, you excommunicate them. They should give up the use of ban, of political force, social force, the cherem, and to resort to persuasion instead of force, to convince the Jews to observe the law and to remain faithful for Judaism. And similarly, he urged, with reference to Christianity, the state and church also to give up their political power and to use persuasion and love. And the truth of the matter is, if you think about it, at least not speak about the state of Israel, where the rabbis seem to have an inordinate fondness for power, but certainly in the diaspora in many ways, this is the rabbinic model today, use of persuasion. So, yeah. 1 second. Positively, Mendelssohn was a learned layperson, but not a rabbi, who derived his authority from both his general secular learning and his broad non-legal Jewish learning, and as well for his general standing in general society. One could have other models like that. Mendelssohn's colleague who collaborated with him on a number of projects, Rabbi Naftali, Hirsch. Wessely, again, was a person of basically broad Hebraic learning, but not specifically legal rabbinic learning based in Talmud and Jewish law. But they represent this maskil, the person of the Enlightenment, as a new authority figure with new vision of the future and future directions for the Jewish community. And obviously, we can say the point of the rabbis is it's very nice that you write commentaries on the Bible or other works or defend the Jewish community, but you have no right to be a leader of the Jewish community unless you're a rabbi with a traditional Jewish, rabbinic, legal learning. Now, we actually have a similar rise of a new type of authority figure in Eastern Europe, oftentimes contrasted, and that's the Jewish revivalist movement of Hasidism. So, type of this popular mystical revival movement, which by the beginning of the 19th century, you could say the Hasidim and the Enlighteners were bitter rivals, very bitter rivals. But in a certain sense, there's a certain, at least negatively, certain similarity with a Hasidic Rebbe, not rabbi, sort of a Rebbe, this leader, as a mystic, a preacher, an intercessor between God and his flock. This Rebbe, who's not necessarily rabbinically learned, although he may be rabbinically learned, competes with the communal rabbi for leadership of the flock. So both the enlightener, the maskil, and the Hasidic Rebbe, as I say, by the beginning of the 19th century, are very much at odds with one another. But what they have in common is competing authority figures for the traditional legal, halachic, rabbinic authority. And in many ways, they're both, actually, in some sense, you could say, using persuasion. We might want to say that, again, nowadays, in a more rational vein, this pastoral model of the Hasidic Rebbe really is true of most modern rabbis as well, who are often looked for their pastoral skills and not necessarily their traditional rabbinic learning. If they have it, very nice, but in some sense, it's the pastoral skills which count. Now, scholars used to speak about the decline of the rabbinate, the rabbinic Judaism in the 18th century. The truth is, ironically, the 18th century is a period of great efflorescence of rabbinic learning. I don't know how much these names will mean to you, but for those who are familiar, I mean, one great rabbinic figure after the other, Rabbi Jacob Emden, Yonatan Eibeshitz, Yechezkel Landau, Joshua Fall, Chidat, David Pardo, Gaon of Vilna. These are really giants, and one after the other appear in the 18th century. Similarly, scholars have now studied court records of rabbinic courts, which, particularly J. Berkowitz, which are functioning very well. They're functioning very well. So it's not so much, at least the way I see it, an inner decline which leads to the rise of these, as it were, competing. So as authority, I think the times are simply too strong. It's a new world, but that will lead me to modernity, so I don't want to encroach on Alan's prerogatives there. So let me go back then. We sort of started with Mendelssohn and Hasidism, in some sense, undermine in various ways traditional rabbinic authority, although, again, they themselves, obviously, the Rebbe and even Mendelssohn are observant Jews. So let's go back to traditional rabbinic authority. So the point I've already been making, and I want to emphasize that, is that given the centrality of halacha, of Jewish law, within, at least in terms of traditional Judaism, and again, the modern period is different, but given the centrality of halacha, of Jewish law, within traditional Judaism, what my teacher, Professor Zatorsky, used to speak about, the halacho-centricity. It's always nice if you have a word with a hyphen in between. The halacho-centricity of Judaism. It's not surprising then that authority in traditional Judaism is grounded in mastery of halacha, of Jewish law. And here we have the figure of the rabbi as halachic virtuoso. So here of course, the key example who comes to mind is Moses Maimonides, 1138 to 1204, maybe the most famous figure of medieval Judaism, one of the most famous Jewish figures altogether, who was a great philosopher, author of the Guide of the Perplexed, the greatest work of medieval rationalist philosophy. Some would drop medieval and say the greatest work of rationalist philosophy, period. But Maimonides' authority derives not so much from his work as a philosopher, but from his halachic stature, his legal stature, as the author of the Mishnah Torah, the great work of Jewish law, which is a type of summa of all of Jewish law, maybe the greatest work of Jewish law written by a single figure, if one thinks of the Mishnah and the Talmud as more collective works. And this raises an interesting question. Can one possess authority in matters of agadah, meaning Jewish law, or theology broadly defined, even if they are not halachic scholars? So here one thinks of many of the great works, let's say, of medieval Jewish thought. Judah Halevi's Kuzari, famous sort of critique of rationalist philosophy. The work, ethical, pietistic, rationalist work of Bachi ibn Pakuda, Duties of the Heart, various works by Kabbalists, all very influential, but none of these figures were noted rabbinic halachic legal scholars. Actually, one rabbinic scholar once dismissed some legal point of Judah Halevi by saying he's not me'anshei Talmud. He's not a Talmudist, so what he says in these areas carries no weight. But still, it's interesting, and this is, I don't want to focus on this, but just sort of raise it. Still, nevertheless, their theological views do have weight and are cited. But I think maybe the real point is that's true, but they're not the leaders of the communities. In terms of who has leadership in terms of the community, these are the great rabbinic, legal, halachic figures. Some of these other figures, this is Professor Moshe Idel, great scholar of Kabbalah, sort of secondary authorities. So this leads me to speak a little bit about the nature and sources and looking at the nature of halacha. So I'm not speaking about the biblical period, I'm not speaking about prophets, I'm not speaking about kings, interesting question, but again, about sort of the traditional rabbinic Judaism as it emerges from the end of the Second Temple, primarily down to the beginning of the modern era, but extending to today as well. So there are really two issues I want to raise, which are separate but interconnected. So what are the views concerning the nature and authority of Jewish law? And second, what are the legal sources of that authority, particularly focusing on tradition and interpretation? And I'm going to gloss over legislation. So contemporary scholar Yochanan Silman has pioneering studies about rationalist versus nominalist views of Jewish law. These terms themselves need to be clarified and may encompass a variety of views. Realist views, did I say rationalist? I said realist views. Realist views means the laws are connected with, they reflect, they're grounded in reality. For example, Kabbalistic views of Jewish law, where the commandments somehow reflect the divine realms and they actually influence. Through performance of the commandments, we actually can influence the divine realms. And almost we have almost like a homology between the commandments and the structure of the commandments and the supernal realms. I'll speak about another idea of realism a bit later. With reference to nominalist views, in the nominalist views, the laws are independent of reality. So what is their basis? So Silman sees the laws in the nominalist view as being grounded in divine command. And I'll come back to that, the type of divine command. But the truth of the matter is, one can have a purely functionalist, nominalist view of Jewish law, for example, Maimonides, which is rationalist in quality. So let's say for Maimonides, let's say impurity is a purely functional category. Impurity means that functionally you are barred from the sacred. You have to act in a certain way or you're prohibited from acting in a certain way. There's no reality as impurity. It's really a matter of rules. But that doesn't mean there can't be a rational function for it. I mean, for Maimonides, we want people to be impure so they shouldn't be barred from the sacred. And since this idea of familiarity breeds contempt, they'll have a certain respect for the sacred. So we have a type of functionalist view with rational goals. Now, Daniel Schwartz, a contemporary scholar, has a classical study. He applied Silman's categories to the Qumran view of law, the Qumranic sectarians, versus the rabbis. The former have a realist view, the latter, the rabbis, a more nominalist view. More recent scholars accept Schwartz's view vis-a-vis Qumran. They take issue with him regarding the rabbis, where actually both nominalist and realist views are to be found. So for Qumran, and briefly, the law in Qumran is anonymous, like there are no names, and unanimous. There are no debates. All this is part of its realist nature, that is grounded in divine revelation, grounded in a cosmic order, almost in the stars and the order of the universe. There is exegesis of Qumran, but the exegesis is divinely inspired. So a good example, and this will really actually be a key text, of the Qumran's law, the realist nature, is the paraphrase in the temple scroll of the verse Deuteronomy 17:11. This is going to be a key text. You shall not depart from what they, the Levitical priests, the judges, what they tell you either to the left or to the right. Don't depart. Seems to be a basis for the authority of whoever considered to be the authorities. This view, as we will see in a minute, is invoked by the rabbis for the basis of their authority. What's interesting is how the temple scroll paraphrases this. You shall not deviate either to the left or to the right from what they tell you, from the Torah, in accordance with the truth. So it's not just simply what they tell you. It has to be based in the text, and it has to be in accordance with the truth, some type of cosmic, real truth. This is interesting because this actually leads, since somehow practice has to accord with the truth, with the cosmic order, this leads actually to a certain type of anxiety in Qumran. Are we doing things right? Yeah. Maybe we're getting it wrong, the fact that our authorities say it. There's similar things later on in the medieval, but I will pass it over. So let me turn then to Pharisaism and Rabbinism, my main concern. So as some of you may know, Josephus famously refers to the Pharisees as relying on the traditions of the fathers. But the exact nature of those traditions and the origins of those traditions are unclear. In later rabbinic tradition, at least some of the traditions are viewed as oral law revealed to Moses on Sinai. Yet the impression one receives from early rabbinic literature is that of the human nature of the law. The views of who cited in the early classics of rabbinic literature, the contemporary rabbis of the day. I mean, there's no type of archaism. Maybe if you really want to establish it, maybe we should cite Moses, maybe we should cite Joshua, maybe we should cite Isaiah. No. Hillel, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Judah, Rabbi Akiva, 2nd century figures. And for the first time we have in Jewish law, laws subject to debate. Now, contemporary scholar Shai Cohn argues that the rabbis allow for debate to minimize the danger of sectarianism. So you want to have a type of broad tent. But in addition to the sociological explanation, it seems as well to inherently derive from the human nature of interpretation exegesis. If you see interpretation exegesis as a type of human activity, it's not surprising that different authorities will arrive at different opinions. The question is, we have the idea of traditions, and then we have the idea of somehow interpretation. To what extent does rabbinic interpretation of the law, midrash halacha as it's called, seek to align the tradition of the fathers with the biblical text? The question, as one scholar puts it, is when is a midrash, this interpretation of the text, a midrash yotzer, when is it a creative midrashic interpretation which gives rise to a new law, and when is a midrash mekayem, an interpretation which seeks to ground what is already known. It tries to retroactively ground laws known through tradition in the biblical text. At one extreme view, we have the view of the great sage Rabbi Akiva, who takes an omnisignificant view of the biblical text. Every letter, every single grammatical form, no matter how insignificant, has meaning, and one can derive laws from it, from the slightest textual anomaly. An extra vav, an extra et, which, as you know, is just a grammatical marker, right, in Hebrew. So Rabbi Akiva was very well known, in many ways controversial, for his attempt to derive laws from these anomalies. Many other rabbis said, you're going too far here. You're going too far. But the interesting question is, does his midrash seek to derive new laws or ground old ones? So there's a very famous story in the Talmud. So Moses goes to receive the Torah, and he sees God writing it in certain textual features, and God tells Moses that in a future time, a great scholar, Rabbi Akiva, will derive heaps and heaps of laws from individual letters. So like you have to imagine sort of a revolving screen, right? A revolving stage. So Moses, Sinai, then or maybe better, movies would be better, right? Fade out. So we have a fade out, and now we're a couple of centuries later in the Academy of Rabbi Akiva, and he's deriving laws, and Moses doesn't understand a word. He doesn't understand a word of what's going on, and he's very depressed. Then, the Talmud says, they get to a certain point, the students ask him, so what's the source of this? And he said, this is a law revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, and Moses is comforted. Now my reading of this, which differs from other readings, is that they're two separate things. Namely, what Rabbi Akiva was saying, all the laws I've taught up till now, I've derived through midrash. So I taught a law about marriage, and you ask me, how do I get it? Oh, we have an extra vav. I teach another law. And you say, where'd you get this law from? I say, oh, we have an extra et. So what I've been doing up to this point is deriving all these laws through this type of creative interpretation. But now you ask me about this particular law. This law I can't derive through interpretation. This law I only know on the basis of tradition. So Moses is relieved. Thank God, at least one law. At least there's one law which he depends upon me for. So he has to rely on tradition. According to this story, though, then, there are different views, obviously. It would seem the bulk of the law really derives through interpretation, and only a relatively small amount is known through tradition. Now, as I mentioned before, many sages opposed Rabbi Akiva's extreme mode of, they oppose his extreme mode of interpretation, and you say, you know, you're basing the law on an and, a conversive vav, on an et. But at least this midrash, at least, seems to be suggesting that God wrote the Torah in such a way that Rabbi Akiva would be able to derive laws through his method of interpretation, through his own creative methods of interpretation. Coming to the issue of realism and nominalism in rabbinic law, is the rabbinic law realist or nominalist? Schwartz argues that rabbinic law is nominalist and grounded in divine will. Supporting this is another famous story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. When he's asked about the rationale of this paradox of the red cow, the paradoxical nature of the red cow, which purifies the impure and makes the pure impure, he says to him that this is a chok hakakti, this is a divine decree. This law is a divine decree, and actually even sharper. The dead body does not defile, and the water does not purify. This is just a divine decree, and don't ask questions. You have no right to question it. So this seems to be a very strong view of a nominalist view there, where he almost says there's no realist, there's no objective purity and impurity. It's just a matter of divine decree. This is an interesting issue. A lot of times you have very dramatic stories which make a point very strongly, but then you look at the nitty-gritty of the evidence, they point in a different direction. So here, if you actually look at the laws of impurity, the actual very complex, detailed laws of impurity in rabbinic literature, it seems that much of the law of impurity was conceived in realist terms, where corpse impurity is actually contrary to this story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. It's conceived of as a type of quasi-physical miasma, which spreads in various directions. So it's really, no, it's really the corpse does make impure, and the water does make pure. So we seem to have different views here. What's also interesting is what we, here we, in some sense, we're speaking about more grounded in physical reality and spiritual reality, like Kabbalah, which I mentioned before, where laws have theurgic effect, but we also really have a type of legal realism. Well, the status oftentimes isn't clear. Legal categories, such as ownership, marriage, impurity, are not conceived of in terms of rules, but in terms of statuses. To use the yeshiva terminology, chalos, a type of status. So the question is, when we have ownership or marriage, are these really rules governing certain types of behavior? And we could summarize it by saying, oh, that's what marriage is. Or it's really the other way around. These are some types of objective type of status, and these objective type of status gives rise to differing rules. Again, Maimonides is very clear, very anti-realist. It's all the law is all a matter of functionality, how to act, how to behave, to achieve certain moral goals, to achieve certain intellectual goals. But the law itself is functional and not grounded in any type of objective order. So, God, that's what happens when you have pages on both printed on both sides. Okay, how are we doing for time?
Oh, we have plenty of time.
Oh, well, I don't want to use all my, okay.
20 minutes.
Fine, okay. Yeah, so the question arises now, this is the last topic which I want to talk about. What is the relationship of the law to truth? And here we come back to the verse, this key verse from Deuteronomy 17:11. If there's a matter of dispute, something's unclear, you go to the judges, the Levitical priests. Al pi Torah asher yorucha, you have to follow the Torah, the teaching that they tell you. Lo tasur yaminu shmol, that's the key verse, right? Don't depart either to the left or to the right. So what we already saw was that the Qumran paraphrased this as, you shall not depart from what they tell you to the left or the right, from the Torah in accordance with the truth, right? So it really has to be grounded in the text. It has to be grounded in the cosmic truth. The rabbis, to the contrary, in the Sifrei, a midrashic commentary on the book of Deuteronomy, says, don't depart either from the left or to the right, even if it appears to you that what they're saying is left is really right, and what they're saying is right is really left. Listen to them. Listen to them. There are actually a number of things. Some say even if it seems to you, which leaves room, oh, but doesn't, it's not really the case. Or others have, even if they say it. So here it seems, as I say, raises an issue of the relationship of the law with truth, on the other hand, with error. I mean, one way of reading it is even if you believe, and maybe you're right, right? That they're in error, still have to listen to them. This calls to mind, and oftentimes the medieval authorities quote these texts together, the famous story of the oven of Akenai, the debate between the late 1st century, early 2nd century sages, Rabbi Eliezer and the sages, who reference to a certain oven, whether it's pure or impure. Rabbi Eliezer said the oven is pure. The sages, who are the majority, and say it's impure, and they outvote him. Rabbi Eliezer brings, interesting, first he brings all legal arguments, and they dismiss them all. Then he performs a whole bunch of miracles. It's interesting what miracles he performs, but he can't go into this, and they say, give me a break, right? You don't prove matters of law from miracles. Finally, as his trump card, he says, if I'm right, let a heavenly voice prove it. And sure enough, a voice comes out from heaven and says, why are you disagreeing with Rabbi Eliezer? The law follows his view. So that's pretty good, right? God supports it. Well, it doesn't actually say God, it's a heavenly voice. Okay. Some commentators try to drive a wedge through them, but simply it seems that God supports it. And then Rabbi Joshua, who seems to be the spokesperson for the majority, quotes the verse from Deuteronomy 36, it is not in heaven. It's not in heaven. The Torah is not in heaven. If you look at the context, in the context it means that it's not in heaven, it's not too difficult to practice. What the rabbis interpret it, it's not in heaven means it's been given over to the rabbis to decide what the law is, and the law, and how do you decide if it's a debate? Majority rule. You can't start appealing to heavenly voices. The story ends, at least the first half of the story is very interesting. Second half, which I can't go into. The first half of the story ends with a rabbi meets Elijah, the prophet. You remember Elijah, the prophet, didn't die, so he's still around. So if you're in the Talmud, righteous people meet Elijah. If you ask how come nowadays we don't meet Elijah, maybe we're not so righteous anymore. And ask, so how did God respond to this? A famous answer, he smiled and said, "My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me." It's a very famous story. Actually, let me just mention the second half. It's a side point. The rabbis decide, Rabbi Eliezer is a dissident sage. We can't take it. We got to crush him. So they excommunicate him. Goes back to Mendelssohn, right? They excommunicate him, and all types of terrible consequences follow from the excommunication. The leader of the rabbinic party, Rabbi Gamliel, dies, and everybody in the Talmud feels that the sages went too far. The way I understand this is the first half is in terms of law, in terms of rabbinic law, you go by majority and you have certain procedures, and the rabbis have the right. In terms of rabbinic policy, matters of policy, here it's not so clear, and the rabbis seem to have actually gone too far. But getting back to the authority of rabbinic law, so how we exactly understand God's response, and getting back to the verse in Deuteronomy, right, the left or the right, even if she's right is left and left is right. So to oversimplify, there seem to be sort of two views among the medievals. A view of a 14th century anonymous author of the Sefer ha-Chinuch. He says there is a matter of objective truth, and the sages can be in error. But you should listen to them even if you think they're wrong. First of all, because they're probably right. 9 out of 10, these are the majority discussed, they're probably right. And secondly, this is the real point. And even if they're wrong, you still have to listen, because otherwise it's anarchy. Because everyone say, "Oh, I know better." You can't have anarchy. So you have a procedure. We have rules. We arrive at them. There's been discussion. You've had your fair say. You still think they're wrong. You got to submit, because otherwise, as I say, for social, political purposes. So this is the Sefer ha-Chinuch. On the other hand, Maimonides, one of the greatest sages of the greatest sage of the 13th century, says, famous view on this verse, the Torah was given in accordance with da'atam, the views of the sages. He says, not 100% clear. Some interpret him like the Sefer ha-Chinuch, but others, and this is my view, and I think there's a lot of evidence for this as well. What he's saying is, the law was really indeterminate and was given in accordance with the view of the sages, and they determined the meaning of it. So there's no objective, transcendent, divine truth up there which you access. No, the meaning of the law itself is indeterminate, and the sages, through their interpretation, determine it. So it really becomes the truth. And that's why you have to listen to it. I mean, this is actually a rather radical view, and has a number of radical consequences, which Maimonides is not hesitant in drawing out. What he says, what this means really then, and he actually states this pretty clearly, is that rabbinic so let's say we have a divine, what you consider to be a divinely revealed interpretation of a text, and rabbinic interpretation, that rabbinic human interpretation of the text really has the same status as divinely revealed interpretation of the text. So he's blurring the distinction between the human and the divine. And as I say, and he's giving interpretation the same status. As I say, he says that. He says it pretty explicitly. As revelation. I really can't go into this too much, but this is really as opposed to Maimonides, who makes a very sharp distinction between divine revelation, divine law, and human interpretation. And for Maimonides, human interpretation does not have the status of divine law at all. It's not it's a supplement. It's authoritative, but it's a human supplement to the divine law. And really, and the most authoritative interpretations are only divinely revealed ones. So it's actually just a sort of contemporary thing. So Maimonides says, so if you know, on the festival of Sukkot, of tabernacles, you have to take 4 species. One of them is the fruit of a goodly tree. What's the fruit of a goodly tree? So traditionally, that's the etrog. The citron goes back, we have archaeological things from 2nd century BCE. So Maimonides says this is, why is this authoritative? Because this is a divine law interpretation revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. The problem is that archaeologists have found nowadays that actually it was only introduced in the Near East in Persian times. So a little too late. A little too late for Moses. So that would be a problem. But the point I want to make is Nachmanides, it wouldn't be such a problem. So the rabbis, yeah, it's a vague text, the fruit of a goodly tree, and it's imprecise. And the rabbis just say, we're going to interpret it. This seems to fit the criteria, certain criteria. So if they interpreted it, so that becomes the meaning of the law. Anyway, that's I was just sort of thinking about this because it's been discussed. It's been discussed recently. But to come back to the main point, the debate between the author of the Chinuch and Nachmanides about the verse, Deuteronomy 17:11. And what is the basis of authority? Is it the idea of, no, there can be an issue of error, but for political reasons as well, for policy reasons, we have to accept the view of the rabbis, or the view of Nachmanides, where no, it's the power of the rabbis to actually determine the meaning of the text, in which case error really becomes irrelevant. So what's interesting, I want to end with this, this is one handout I gave you, do I have it here somewhere? Maybe you can give me the, yeah. Is a 20th century expression of the view of the author of the Chinuch. This is rather interesting. This is by Rabbi Moses Feinstein, who died in 1985, who was known as the greatest rabbinic posek, the sizer, right, in North America in about 1950 to 1980. This is my English translation. There's another English translation by Rabbi Feinstein's son-in-law, Rabbi Moses Tendler, which has been published. But Rabbi Tendler seems to, all right, let me not be too nasty. Let's just say Rabbi Tendler seems to play freely and freely paraphrase and weaken the force. And weaken the force of what Rabbi Feinstein says. So Rabbi Feinstein sort of raises the question is, nowadays, how can we give decisions, sort of humility, and also the idea of decline of generations, right? How can we give decisions on important matters of Jewish law, marriage and divorce, life and death? Maybe we'll get it wrong. These are very complex issues and very serious issues. So how could we do this? So he says, in my humble opinion, it's proper for an obligatory sages of recent generations. No, we have the authority. Not only have the authority, we have the obligation to issue authoritative rulings, hora'ah. Even though had these sages lived in the times of the Talmud, they would not have been considered as having reached the rank of being worth of hora'ah. Compared to the early great Talmudic rabbis, who are we, right? Since, here's the point, what are we concerned? We're concerned that in making their rulings, they would not determine the law in accordance with the truth vis-a-vis heaven. So that's an interesting phrase. The type of objective truth. The Hebrew is emet klape shmaya. The truth vis-a-vis heaven. They'll get it wrong vis-a-vis heaven. You can see how this is a development of the Sefer ha-Chinuch, but sharpening it. However, regarding the truth of hora'ah, he had emet shel hora'ah, of authoritative rulings. So it's interesting. He's actually speaking about two truths here. Somehow the heavenly truth, an objective heavenly truth, and there the sages can get it wrong, right? And then there's a truth of authoritative ruling. And it's been stated, again, the verse of where Rabbi Joshua says in this debate with Rabbi Eliezer, it is not in heaven, but it's in accordance with how it appears to the sage after he is properly inquired to clarify the law as it emerges from the Talmud and codes, in accordance with the best of his strength and with great seriousness and fear of heaven. So it doesn't mean it's free-for-all, right? It doesn't mean, you just flip a coin or whatever, just decide casually. You have to be a great sage. You have to be a master of all of the rabbinic literature. You have to have the seriousness. You have to take these decisions seriously. But if you met all these criteria, there's another truth, the truth of hora'ah. So that's the same idea, or not same, similar idea, but different from what the chinuch is more of a matter of policy. Right? You have to accept what the sages say, even if it's an error, because otherwise we have anarchy. You have to have a system of authority. Here he says, no, it is an error vis-a-vis heaven, but there's another truth, and that's the key truth. And that truth is the truth of authoritative ruling. So that, I think, is a very interesting idea. Even though it is revealed to heaven that the correct explanation is not that way. So that's the truth of hora'ah, and you have the obligation to rule according to that truth. And as a reference to this, these are the words of the living God. The proper explanation appears to be in accordance with his ruling, and there's no contradiction to his words. I mean, obviously, you have to be aware of the text, and if there's an obviously flaw in your ruling, then we throw it out. But as I say, I think this is actually similar to the Sefer ha-Chinuch, but sharpening it. It's not a matter of policy, but we have the idea of two truths, and the truth which counts in terms of the rabbinic system is the truth of authoritative ruling. And that you only know on the basis of your best judgment, obviously given all of your knowledge and examination of the sources. So the question which I want to leave you with is we really actually seem now to have two radical views. We have the view of Maimonides, who says there is no real objective truth because God has given the sages the power to determine the meaning of the law in accordance with their understanding, and that becomes the meaning. And then we have the view of Rabbi Moses Feinstein, who speaks about two truths and says the key truth in terms of the law is not the heavenly truth, but the truth of authoritative ruling. So the question I want to leave you with is, so which of these two views accords greater authority to the decisions of the sages? So thank you very much.